Simply Napoleon, written by J. David Markham and Matthew Zarzeczny, narrated by Jack Wynters. Preface. Napoleon is the greatest man that has ever lived. Since the world has existed, there has never appeared a general, a conqueror, or a king who can be compared to him. With these words, Louis Bonaparte, a relatively short-reigning ruler of Holland in the early 19th century, lauded his more illustrious brother. While this praise may seem like a fraternal hyperbole, Louis was hardly alone in this grandiose assessment, although we disagree that Napoleon cannot be compared to anyone else in history. Still, we, like many historians before us, would only offer a handful of names for such a comparison. Napoleon Bonaparte, or Emperor Napoleon I, was without any doubt one of the most influential and remarkable people who has ever lived. Only an elite group of individuals are reasonably categorized in the same class as Napoleon: Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, and Charlemagne, all of whom Napoleon admired and compared himself to, can justifiably be placed alongside Napoleon as the truly greatest men of human history. The importance of these leaders as military innovators, empire builders, and so much more is difficult to quantify. To that end, Simply Napoleon should bring a well-researched look at France's legendary emperor and military commander to a wide general audience, including those who have heard of Napoleon. Yes, there's even a Pizza Hut commercial in which the current United States President Donald Trump compares himself to Napoleon, and yet do not really know the history of this iconic figure. This book is written in an easily readable manner, without the technical jargon often found in biographies and studies directed at a primarily academic audience of our fellow professors. Moreover, it is intended as a fairly concise overview of Napoleon's life and times, and serves as a sort of introduction and study guide of the great man and his many groundbreaking accomplishments. Although he is the central figure of this volume, Napoleon is joined by a veritable cast of fascinating people who played their own roles in influencing Bonaparte's life, as well as his successes and failures. In the coming pages, you will learn about Napoleon's tumultuous love life. He was married twice and had many mistresses, as well as his large family with ambitious brothers and sisters who would join Napoleon in ruling various kingdoms and principalities in Europe. Napoleon also had to contend with members of Europe's traditional ruling dynasties, the Bourbons, the Habsburgs, the Hohenzollerns and Romanovs, who were sometimes allied with the Bonapartes and at other times their bitter enemies. The story of Napoleon goes beyond the lives of monarchs and their spouses to include diplomats, lawyers, politicians, priests, rebels, scientists and soldiers, all of whom had in some way shaped the emperor's private, public, and military life. Statesmen helped negotiate the treaties that redrew the world's maps. Lawyers and politicians enacted laws under Napoleon's guidance that would be adapted by countries across the world, from Asia to North America. Bishops, priests, and even rabbis all worked with Napoleon in the undertaking of numerous religious reforms, including a concordat between Napoleonic France and the Holy See that lasted for over 100 years, from 1801 to 1905, foreshadowing agreements made between Fascist Italy in 1929 and Nazi Germany in 1933 with the Holy See in the 20th century. Thus, because the Napoleonic Code, the French Civil Code established in 1804, and the Concordat of 1801 are accepted as two of the most important and influential documents in all of modern world history, their authors are worthy of remembering. So, too, are the rebels in Haiti and Spain, who unleashed horrors on Napoleon's forces. While we do address those atrocities, we only scratch the surface of the darkest moments of the era. Far less disturbing were the architects, artists, scholars, and scientists of that era. Working on Napoleon's behalf, they advanced our understanding of ancient Egypt. while also producing some of the finest paintings and monuments that are still visited and admired every day by millions of people from around the world. Finally, we also mention the many soldiers who fought, bled, and in many cases even died in the numerous battles and campaigns fought by Napoleon and his subordinates in battlefields around the world. This book will enlighten our readers about the life of a military genius who led armies to Egypt, the Holy Land, and across Europe. Napoleon sent his forces to battle Haitians in the Caribbean and doubled the size of the United States with one of history's most celebrated real estate deals, the Louisiana Purchase. But he was more than just a conqueror and gifted general. He was also an activist of sorts, bringing reforms to France's education and legal systems, the positive changes that far outlasted Napoleon's conquests and influenced, in some cases to this day, reforms in many other countries as well. Having achieved so much in one of history's most turbulent eras, that of the French Revolution, Napoleon has been the subject of countless works of art, literature, and cinema. Everything from restaurants, Napoleon's Pizza, for example, to psychological conditions, Napoleon Complex, have been named after him. Once again, few men or women have had such an enduring influence on the world's military, education systems, laws, and popular culture. His accomplishments during his life were significant, and so too were his failures. For not everyone who acknowledges Napoleon as an important or influential figure necessarily sees him as a great man in the positive sense. Both during and after his life, he has had his share of venomous detractors who pointed to the death toll of his many wars as his truest legacy. Although such luminous men as Britain's erstwhile Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, disagreed with comparisons of Napoleon with Adolf Hitler, others, including our fellow contemporary historian Claude Ribbe, embrace parallels between the French Emperor and the German dictator. In his 2005 book, Le Crime de Napoléon, Napoleon's Crime, Ribbe alleges that Napoleon's forces used sulfur dioxide gas to mass execute over 100,000 rebellious blacks on Saint-Domingue, now Haiti, and Guadeloupe, an action that Ribbe saw as a model for Hitler's Holocaust in the 20th century. Ribbe is hardly the only scholar to present Napoleon in such negative light. American historian Alan Shom wrote a lengthy and maligned biography of Napoleon, published in 1997, and is anything but flattering. In a review of this book on the website, the Napoleon series, www.napoleon-series.org, Kevin Kiley, author of the much more positively reviewed Artillery of the Napoleonic Wars, published in 2004, denounced Shom for, among other things, doing his prejudiced best to blacken Napoleon's reputation. Ribbe and Shom may represent some of the most noticeable recent historians to criticize Napoleon sharply, but they are preceded by numerous people of diverse backgrounds from as far back as Napoleon's life. To see negative perceptions of Bonaparte dating back to his lifetime, one need only look at the many cartoons by such artists as Britain's James Gillray that present mocking caricatures of Napoleon, akin to what we see in newspapers today of our present politicians. Over the course of Napoleon's career, and after, cartoonists, pamphleteers, and some of Europe's propagandists continued to ridicule Napoleon and even portray him as an antichrist. As you will learn in the following pages, alongside the positive descriptions of Bonaparte as a hero and humanitarian, a number of his contemporaries and some modern scholars have denounced him as bad and even evil. How can one and the same person be revered as the greatest man who ever lived by some, and denounced as a warmongering and even genocidal tyrant by others? Why has he been so polarizing and controversial? Or was Napoleon, as we would argue, more complicated than to be classified as either good or evil? Is he, as British historian David Chandler asserted, a great bad man, or is another description more accurate? by reading this volume, you will perhaps develop your own opinions of this much debated and perhaps even misunderstood man. In the pages that follow, we seek to explore many facets of Napoleon and his policies in chapters organized chronologically by key phases of his life. We start with his childhood, which had an unquestionable formative influence upon him, especially his upbringing by his mother, and then explore his education and early military schooling before moving on to his career as an officer in the French army amid the tumult of the French Revolution. From there, we see how Napoleon rose through the ranks to lead French forces in their conquests of Italy and then Egypt in a manner sometimes compared, even by Napoleon himself, to the exploits of Alexander the Great. Our next chapter sees Napoleon lead France as a reform-minded consul, reminiscent of the flurry of activity undertaken by ancient Roman consul and dictator Julius Caesar nearly 2 millennia earlier. Afterward, Napoleon traded the trappings of republicanism for something more akin to establishing a Charlemagne-esque imperial system that dominated Western Europe. Afterward, we focus first on the period of imperial glory, followed by Napoleon's precipitous fall and eventual final defeat. We continue with his life and death in exile before concluding with an examination of the aftermath, Napoleon's legacy that endures to the present, as is evident by even your reading this volume today. Our coverage within these 10 chapters includes some topics that go beyond just a narrative of Napoleon's life to place him in his historical context and to show how extensive his influence was on world history. As you can tell already from the preceding paragraphs, his significance was and still is widespread. Indeed, modern historians from Paul Fregosi to J.P. Riley have written books with titles that explicitly refer to the Napoleonic Wars as a world war. Yet, as we mentioned above, Bonaparte was more than merely a military figure. His varied accomplishments have helped shape the world we live in today, and, for better or worse, without Napoleon's influence on so many aspects of our history, the world today would likely be quite a different place. It is hardly surprising, then, that numerous articles, essays, and books addressing various counterfactuals or what-ifs of the Napoleonic age continue to speculate how even seemingly minor changes in Napoleon's life could have had far-reaching consequences. We continue to ask questions and search for answers about this beguiling man who has arguably influenced all of us in a variety of ways. Was he really the greatest man who ever lived? Read on and reach your own conclusion. As for Napoleon, his journey, well, as is the case with all of us really, began when he first entered our world. Nearly 10 years before the birth of Louis Bonaparte, and many decades before Louis's designation of his older brother as history's greatest man, the birth of Napoleon Bonaparte to his mother, Laetitia, would commence a life only paralleled by a handful of individuals. So, let us start with the story of a boy and his mother, and how this relationship changed the course of world history. Chapter 1. The Little Corsican, Napoleon's Childhood, 1769 to 1789. As a youth, growing up on his island home of Corsica, the future emperor of the French and one of history's greatest conquerors, Napoleon Bonaparte, already wore a military uniform. On a particularly painful occasion, the young Napoleon's mother, Laetitia, dealt him a sharp punishment. She tricked her son into believing that he had been invited to dine by the island's governor. Then, as Napoleon changed his clothes, she seized him, laid him across her knee, and proceeded to spank him. Why? He and his sister, Pauline, had earlier mocked their hobbling grandmother, Laetitia's mother. Whereas her mother spanked Pauline immediately when Laetitia learned of her children's misbehavior, Napoleon could not justly be punished while wearing his sacred uniform. This incident says much about Napoleon's upbringing. Although his mother was not formally educated, she demonstrated practical intelligence throughout her life. She also had an undeniable sense of dignity, frugality, and tenacity, as might be expected of a woman who had endured some of the later months of her pregnancy with Napoleon while a refugee in the mountains of Corsica. Ever since his birth, on August the 15th, 1769, his mother instilled a strong sense of stern discipline in young Napoleon, befitting a descendant of minor nobility. Letizia was born in 1750 in Ajaccio, Corsica, then part of the Republic of Genoa. Her father was a captain of Corsican regiments of chivalry and infantry in the Genoese army. After he died, her mother married a Swiss-born captain in the service of Genoa who was stationed in Corsica. In 1764, when just a teenager, Letizia married a Corsican lawyer, Carlo Buonaparte, who was 5 years her senior. Carlo would become Napoleon's father. Yet the job of raising the sometimes rambunctious future emperor mostly fell to his mother. Near the end of his life, Napoleon reflected from his exile on St. Helena. "I was very well brought up by my mother. I owe her a great deal. She instilled into me pride and taught me good sense." That is not to say Napoleon always went along with his mother's wishes. As the award-winning author Elaine Landau recounted, sometimes he traded the loaf of fine white bread his mother gave him to take to school for a piece of the soldier's tough dark bread. Napoleon claimed he didn't want to be pampered and preferred to eat like a real soldier. Nevertheless, Letizia made a sound effort to be something of a maternal general to her little soldier. Landau explained that when she found out that Napoleon had been less than truthful, she whipped him soundly. Letizia could be harsh, but she instilled a desire in Napoleon to do well and complete any task he undertook. Throughout Napoleon's childhood, Letizia served as the disciplinarian. While reining in the notoriously ambitious Napoleon was an impressive enough feat, Madame Buonaparte did so while raising 7 other children who survived infancy. She bore 13 children altogether, but 5 died as infants.
Soldiers, 40 centuries of history look down upon you.